And good morning or afternoon. This is Mr. Harold with video number 2 dealing with Beowulf and the Anglo Saxon time period. Today we're going to be talking about the background that Beowulf takes place in. Who were the Anglos? Who were the Saxons? And who were the Jutes, and why does nobody talk about them anymore? We're basically looking at the very beginning of English. So come along, let's take a look at how English, the Anglo-Saxons and Beowulf, all got started. The first thing you need to know is that the Anglo-Saxon period was a period of invasion. Britain was dominated by waves and waves of tribes that were coming in from all directions. The Romans had left because, well, their empire fell apart. So we had a bunch of different tribes coming in from what is now known as Germany, which is why they're called Germanic tribes. We had the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who you never really hear about. The main part of Britain was taken over by the Angles and Saxons and became known as Angleland. Say that over and over again. What does it sound like? Yes, England. And that's where we get the name of it today. So let's take a look at a map here. You can see at the top we have the Middle Angles, the South Angles, the East Angles. I assume these are the North Angles. They're at the top of the country. The Saxons are in the south, and the words Saxon and South are similar for a reason. And then you have two little pockets of Jutes. The Jutes weren't a very big deal, so obviously they didn't get really named in the whole time period. Over here you have the native Britons. The native Britons would have been known as the Celts or the Celts, and they were around before the Angles and Saxons showed up, and they continued after they had arrived and gradually were forced out as the society advanced. So let's take a look at the entire history. Around the 400 BCs, we have the Celts coming in. Prior to this, perhaps the island was empty. We really don't know of anybody else that was there. But the Celts come in around 400 BC, and we'll talk about them in a second. Around 43 BC, so about 400 years later, the Romans come in and they take over much of England. Now, England would have been at the far edge of the Roman Empire, so they didn't really care about it too much, but of course, when you're making an empire, it's nice to have all the land you can get. The 400 to 1000s, this is when the Anglo-Saxons are there. The Roman Empire has fallen. The Germanic tribes come in, they take over. The Celts are still there, off in their corner. They've been hiding all this time, but not really doing very much because they don't really have the ability to. And then finally, in 1066, the Normans come in and they invade England. The Normans are from Normandy, which hopefully you know is in France. Let's talk about the Celts. I mentioned them a few times earlier. Take a look at this picture. When somebody says Celts, the first thing you think of is the Boston Celtics. The second thing you might think of is Lucky Charms, but really it was a lot more than that. The Celts were governed by a group called the Druids. This was their form of religion, and they would practice at, many believe, at Stonehenge. They were a very mysterious group. They had a strong belief in magic, in nature, in human sacrifices. One of the names of their tribes was the Breton tribe, which is one of the reasons the entire island is later named Great Britain. And they were really all about the violence and magic and adventure and really just what people feel. It was a very primitive culture in that sense, not a lot of focus on law and order and organization. So this tribe exists. We really don't know too much about them. Some people claim to. There's all kinds of stories out there, but really don't know too much about them. The Romans, we could talk about the Roman Empire for weeks, but basically let's take a look at how Rome changed England. It brought a number of things to England here, including economy, trading, organized government, organized cities that lasted. Prior to this, cities just sort of came up for a few days and left as the people moved around. The Romans introduced transportation. That's one of the reasons the Romans could take over the world, is that they built roads. They introduced protection, the idea of setting up more than just a temporary fence, but building a wall. Here's a picture of a wall over here that they had built, and here's what it looked like in the country. It actually went all the way across. Not quite the Great Wall of China, but not too shabby. The Romans, of course, went back to Rome when the empire started to fall, but all of these things remained in place. The Anglo-Saxons, they come in, and they're really the basis of what we think of as English today. They had very guttural sounds. They spoke in a lot of spoken language. As you saw in the earlier video, you saw some of the words that they have embedded in our culture. Very simple words, harsh-sounding words. And they spoke in a language called Old English. I hope you have a chance to watch the Old English example video. It really gives you a sense of what it actually sounded like. It is nothing like what we say today. A lot of people think Old English means Shakespeare. That's actually modern English. Old English, you really can't even recognize it except for a word or two. Here's what the Anglo Saxons looked like when they were coming in. We had the Angles coming from this stretch over here. You had the Saxons coming in from this south area over here, and then you had the Jutes settling in these few areas. Again, the Jutes, they always get sort of forgotten, but they were one of the three tribes that invaded. Okay, so let's talk about what the Anglo-Saxons actually did at the time, because they're really the groups that we want to look at. Anglo-Saxons, they existed in these small little villages. In the settlement, we would have the main hall. This is where the king would live. Now, the king wasn't really a king in the sense of having a control over a huge country. He was probably just king of the village, or king of a few villages, or king of a dozen villages. He would be there, he would host parties in the evening, he would have his meetings. You notice there's only a handful of buildings here. So likely in the evening, every single person in the town was in the main halls. Around the town we have a wooden barricade. Well, why is that? Yes, it's to protect from other people coming into the village. It's also to protect against monsters. This Celtic idea of monsters had carried over, and so there was this belief that monsters would come in and invade the village if they weren't careful in the evening, so they built these fences around. Here's how their society looked. There was God at the top. Eventually it became the Christian God, but in the beginning it's sort of a mixture of pagan gods. Then you have the king, and while the king is in charge, he's sort of the first among equals. There's a number of high-ranking officers, and the king wasn't really fully powered. And then you have the thanes, they were the warriors, and everybody else was really a slave. So you better be at the top of this pyramid if you wanted to have anything nice. What did the Anglo-Saxons believe in? Well, they believed in a mixture of pagan values and Christian values. For example, the early Anglo-Saxons believed in no afterlife, that the only thing you could do was kill and destroy and gain power on earth. They believed in honor and pride and reputation, they believed in revenge, and they believed in many gods. Now the Christians come in around the 600s and they introduce these traditional Christian values, the idea that there is a heaven and a hell, the idea that maybe pride isn't so great a thing, the idea of being kind and merciful, and the idea of one God. Now, in the story we're going to read in Beowulf, you're going to see a mixture of these things. At times, Beowulf is talking about his need for pride and glory and revenge, and then on the other times, you're going to see the people praying to the Christian God, praying for help. You're going to see people talking about how they need salvation from the monster. So it's an interesting mix. Now, the Anglo-Saxons don't get to keep the country all by themselves that whole 600 years. At one point, the Vikings invade, and I'm sure you've all heard about the Vikings with their horns on their helmets. That's probably not accurate, but the Vikings were very fearsome. They did like to destroy lots of things, so they found England much more pleasant than where they had come from, and so they set up camps in the area and gained control. It was a surprise. No one really expects Vikings to come in and invade. The Vikings, they finally were defeated by the Anglo-Saxon king, Alfred the Great. However, because they were there, some of their words, as you heard in the other video, were able to come into the culture. And this is around the 700s. Alfred the Great is able to unite everybody in the country, and we have education and we have culture. This continues for about 300 years, until finally one of Alfred the Great's successors, Harold, spelled with one R, I might notice, it's completely different. He was defeated by William the Conqueror, the Norman French king, and that was pretty much it for the Anglo-Saxons. The French came in, took over pretty much everything, the Anglo-Saxon nobles were defeated, and it brought about a new time period for England. And that's what we're going to get to in the next unit, but not just yet. Let's talk about the literature at the time. Literature at the time was not what we think of it today. Writing was very primitive, very little was actually written down. It was mainly epic poems and epic heroes. It was brutal, it was harsh, it was very black and white. What would happen is the people of the town would gather in the mead halls and they would listen to people come in and sing and tell epic stories. Poems weren't just an entertainment lesson, though. They told about history, and they told about religion, and they told about cultural values. So in Beowulf, you're going to see it's more than just a man fighting a monster. You're also going to see a little bit of a sermon in there. You're going to see discussions of some elements of history. And these stories are very long. They cover usually 50 years because they talk about things that have happened in the region for a long period of time. What is an epic hero? I mentioned that earlier. You have an epic poem, and then in the epic poem you have an epic hero. It's a little bit different than we think of heroes today. If you've ever seen The Dark Knight or Man of Steel, which just came out, you'll notice we like our heroes today to be very nuanced. They aren't sure whether they should use their powers. They don't know what their purpose is. Do they want to hurt somebody or not hurt somebody? What are they doing? That seems to be what America is all about today. But back then, they wanted their heroes to be big and broad and bold. They were noble by birth. They were very violent. They were very harsh. And they performed superhuman deeds. We do carry that over in our superheroes. But back then, they would perform superhuman deeds. They would swim underwater for hours at a time. They would swim in boiling water. They would rip off the arm of a monster with just the strength that they had with them. And usually these epic heroes would stand alone against a monster or an army in order to save the entire country. An epic hero. An epic poem, well, what's the characteristics of an epic poem? Aside from involving religion and culture and entertainment, it's usually rather large. It involves more than one country. It's complicated in that there are a number of supernatural beings. You'll notice the plots aren't very complex otherwise, though. It's pretty much a hero against a villain, and they fight. The dialogue is usually long and formal. There's not a lot of witty one-liners. People speak very formally, and we have some large themes. Courage, honor, good and evil, life and death. It really doesn't get much bigger than that, does it? That's an epic poem. Now, Beowulf itself, where is this from? Why are we even reading this? Well, frankly, it's the only one left. Beowulf could easily be the worst epic poem that was ever written. We would never know. All the other epic poems are gone, mainly because of the Vikings that we mentioned earlier. They destroyed everything, including all the manuscripts. We think it's from the year 750, but we don't know. We don't know who the author is. It was written by a Christian monk. That's really the only reason it survived. So if you like it, you can thank that monk, and if you don't like it, then, well, you can not thank that monk. Because a monk wrote it, he put in a lot of Christian values. He probably heard the story being told by pagans, and in it he interjected his own views. Although it's written in England, it's actually not taking place in England. It takes place in Denmark, and every now and then you'll see Beowulf and his team. They come in, and they are known as the Geats, and they are from modern-day Sweden. So this is an Old English story that takes place in Denmark, starring Swedish people. It celebrates the warrior culture. It celebrates strength and courage and honor. Are you getting it? I've been repeating myself a lot. So, one last thing before this video ends. You need to pay attention to 3 poetic devices. You are going to be held responsible on these in some later assignments. The first one is called alliteration. Now, you've seen this before. Alliteration is when you have 2 sounds at the beginning of a word that are the same. Think of any type of tongue twister you've ever told. Tongue twister you've ever told. That's one right there. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That's alliteration. As you read Beowulf, you'll notice there are many, many examples of alliteration. If you listen to the original version of Beowulf, they were so good that every single line was almost entirely done with words starting with the same letter. I don't have a copy of it in your textbook, but you can go and take a look. The second one is a caesura. A caesura is a pause dividing each line. You'll notice as you read that sentences don't stop at the end of the line. The lines usually have some sort of arbitrary ending. This was done for poetic devices. It was the idea was that you would read each line and then sort of pause. The lines don't rhyme. It's not a sing-songy pattern. It's designed to sort of move in a strange sense that makes you read something differently because it sounds poetic. So pay attention to how they divide each line. The last thing is called a kenning. You and I, we don't really use kennings anymore. We use what are called pronouns. For example, if I have a friend named Jim and I want to say Jim went to the store, Jim then went outside, Jim went home, Jim cooked dinner, and Jim went to sleep, I eventually will just start using the word he. But in epic poems, that's sort of boring. You can't just say he, or Jim, Jim, Jim. They start to come up with new and exciting names for these people and these objects. So instead of calling him Jim, they will call him grocery finder. They will call him dinner slayer. They will call him TV watcher. They will come up with all sorts of nicknames throughout the story. They will call him Jackson's son, assuming Jim's father's name is Jackson. They will have all sorts of strange names in there. So as you read, look for these kennings. I have an example on this PowerPoint. It says that Grendel, at one point, he is called mankind's enemy. Well, because in the story, he's fighting mankind. So these three things, alliteration, caesura, and kenning, you're going to need to look for these, and when you write your own story, you're going to need to be able to repeat them. All right, well, I'll let you get started on the actual story. Thanks for stopping by. Be sure to check out the other videos, and have a great night.